Good evening, everyone. This evening we're going to speak about a new discovery. It needs a bit of unpicking. So this is what I'm calling a Viking Age fort. I will define what Viking Age means in a minute. It sits next to the Ford of Frew, and those paying attention will note that I haven't said the Fords of Frew, which is how it appears in popular accounts. And as you can see here, we've got Bonnie Prince Charlie, a Viking, and Rob Roy, all of whom are linked to the Fords of Frew, and all of that is to do with first Walter Scott and latterly Buchan. So the Fords of Frew, an alliteration, a poetical phrase, is often described as the most important ford in Scotland, the only place across Flanders Moss that you can cross, and the first place to the west of Stirling that you can cross this bog, all of which is untrue, but I'll explore all of that and why that relates to this Viking Age fort. So, next slide, please. Now, I think the Viking Age needs a bit of unpicking. This is how we are really describing the latter period of the early medieval, the period immediately prior to David I's coronation, which is 899 years ago, 900 years next year. And David really marks the kind of introduction of the modern period. But if you're paying attention to the slide, you'll see that I've defined the Viking Age as running from 793, the first recorded Viking raid on Britain in Lindisfarne, all the way through to the Battle of Largs in 1263. In England, the Viking Age ends a bit earlier, 1066, but we still have Vikings trying to, or rather, Norwegian kings, kings from Denmark, still interfering in Scottish politics really till 1263. And of course, in the late 15th century, or the mid-15th century, James III gets Orkney and Shetland as a dowry from his queen. So, you know, those Viking raiders still have a large role to play in Scotland's history. However, we have a series of raids and invasions which really run from circa 800 to circa 1263. That's what I'm going to call the Viking Age. Now, in a Stirling context, we've got the Battle of Dollar, 875. This is likely to be a raid from a great land army, which is either marching south or west following the siege of Dumbarton Rock in 870. And you'll remember that's the 3-month-long siege that results in the collapse of Alclud. And we probably have a Viking encampment on the 4th. Certainly place names, find spots, etc. There's no reason why the 4th wouldn't be an area focused. And if we have a look in the immediate area of Stirling, we've got a raid on Dunblane recorded in 912. We have what I'm going to call the newly discovered monastery at Old Kilmadock. And you might recognise the Pictus cross slab there that was uncovered last year, with an Ogham inscription on its side. There are 2 or 3 early inscribed stones from Old Kilmadock, and of course the place name Kilmodoc, the cell of the beloved Doc, and we have some evidence for Doc or someone Doc, a saint in the area. So there's probably some kind of monastery, and of course the other picture shows one of the 4 or up to 4 hogbacks in Logie, just to the north of Stirling. So there is a lot of Viking evidence, not as much as Orkney and Shetland or as Govan, but certainly things are going on, and we should expect them to go on. There are places to raid, there are wealth to be accumulated, and of course the transit north or south via Stirling. So next slide, please. And here we have Paris's mid-13th century map, which makes that strategic point. You will have seen this map before numerous times, and it just makes that strategic point, that you can see the Clyde there, you can see the Forth, all of which are slightly mixed together with Flanders Moss. There is only one bridge marked on the whole of this map, only one bridge worthy of being marked in Britain, and it's Stirling Bridge. It's not Stirling that's marked, it's Stirling Bridge. And Stirling Bridge apparently crosses the Sea of Scotland. It just underlies how significant the land crossing was at Stirling. So Viking armies and indeed Pictish armies, and indeed Northumbrian armies, and indeed armies from Strathclyde, and indeed armies from Dalriada are all raiding to control or to raid across this land bridge, which is Stirling. If we get the next slide, please. And here we have the actual reality. So the deep green here is underwater 10,000 years ago. You can see the Forth there, the meanders. You can see the shortest land crossing between Castle Rock and the Abbey Craig, which coincides with the bulk. I'm not quite sure how to explain this. Generally, we think the upper tidal limit, the Forth, is Kildene. The tidal impact is felt as far as Kippen. And there's a half-meter tidal surge will take you all the way past Kippen. But generally, people talk about Kildene as being the upper tidal limit. So we have the shortest land crossing. We have the upper tidal limit. The name Stirling probably means upper navigable bit, lowest crossing point, all those kinds of things. And as soon as we get historical records, which really from the 1304 siege of Stirling Castle all the way through to 1745, we find a series of military accounts and assessments of Stirling and simply the importance of the crossing. Edward I has spies watching fords. There are troops launched sent to monitor the fords in 1689. In 1715, the Jacobites are expecting the fords to be mined, and in 45, we have all sorts of things going on, but notably, General Cope, the British general, criticised for not simply waiting at Stirling for Bonnie Prince Charlie to come south, and indeed he's in Inverness by the time Bonnie Prince Charlie is crossing at Stirling. Now, where does Bonnie Prince Charlie cross? Bonnie Prince Charlie crosses at the Ford of Frew. Now, he crosses there. We know this. We have it in a series of accounts, poetry, a newspaper account of the time. The Scots Magazine is following the Jacobites, poetry, and also some diary accounts of people following the invasion. Now, he crosses at the Ford of Frew because the bridge at Drip could be fired upon with cannon at the castle. And looking at that map, I'm not sure how easily you can see Craigforth there, which is the sort of pale yellow mound to the west of Stirling Castle. That's roughly where Drip Bridge is. So really, in keeping with this tactic that lets Cope march to Inverness, no one knows where Bonnie Prince Charlie is. So they're using a lesser known ford in order to maintain secrecy about their whereabouts. So they cross it through and then march to Stirling and hit the Roman road, and then march south. And of course, that ends up in Derby. And we all know about that. So looking in detail at the Ford of Frew. So if we have the next slide, please. Now, one of the things that you will find mentioned about the Ford of Frew is that one of the seven wonders of Scotland, etc., all these things I've heard before. And one of the justifications for bigging up, as it were, the ford is that there are two brochs, one to the north and one to the south. And of course, we've got Musa there in the picture, and of course, the Stirling brochs are all much smaller and much more degraded. But the two red are the brochs. The icon is the Ford of Frew, and you can actually see that the Ford of Frew is not in the middle of those two brochs. There's actually another fording point, and depending how well you can see that screen, the other fording point sits to the immediate east of the confluence with the Goody Water. If you cross at the Ford of Frew, you have to cross the Goody Water too. Whereas if you cross to the east of the confluence with the Forth and the Goody Water, you don't. And that is the position that the two Brochs occupy. They control the easterly fording point. So that's the most important fording point from prehistory. It's just there isn't that alliteration, which means that Walter Scott isn't as impressed with that ford as he is with the Ford de Frew, and of course Bonnie Prince Charlie crossed there. So you have a snowballing effect where the most romantic anti-hero of the 18th century crosses at a place with poetical potential, and then Walter Scott runs with it. And we end up with an accumulation of myth. So next slide, please. Now, I need to speak a little bit about geopolitics at this point. So there's a lot in that little text there, but in essence, we have a sub-Roman province called Manau. Manau is mentioned in Roman provinces, in Roman sources, in probably the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. Last mentioned in 711 with the Battle of the Plain of Manau, and survives in 4 or 5 place names: Clackmannan, obviously easily enough, Slamannen, Cromannan at Balfron, and Rathmannan near St Andrews. And then there is another one whose name escapes me in West Lothian. So a massive area, kind of the centre belt of Scotland, with the kind of central point, the fording point at Stirling. We have invasions from Northumbria pushing north. They control the fording point. Then the Picts push south after 685 in the Battle of Dunnikin. And what we end up with is the Forth as frontier, right? So the Forth is the frontier, and between 700 and 11-ish, 1100-ish, 1124-ish. Now, you'll see a little note there. I'm just going to make this point again. Rather, I will come back to it. The kingdom to the north of the Forth was Pictland. It then becomes Alapa. It is the frontier. We know it's the frontier because we have a reference in the reign of Kenneth II, following a raid on Northumbria and then a retaliatory raid northwards. Kenneth orders the banks of the ford of Forthrin, and we think Forthrin is the Forth, and in the past people have linked the fords of Forthrin to the fords of Frew. So we have a frontier on the Forth, and we have an active phase of fortification on the Forth in the 10th century, i.e. the Viking Age. Now, just moving forward, just to give you a little bit further context, the kings of Alapa, so Malcolm III, who is the Malcolm from Macbeth, married to St Margaret, and his children push south. And we think there is a sequence that they conquer, they build a castle, and then things expand. Now, David I, we've spoken of him before, comes to the throne 900 years ago next year, one of Scotland's greatest kings. Now, no one expected David I to inherit. He is actually 5th in line in terms of children from David's second marriage. And 4 of his children, 4 of the older children die. 2 of them are Scottish kings, Edgar and Alexander. We know that it's in Alexander's reign that the first mention of Stirling Castle occurs. Now, no one expected David to inherit, and David is given a buffer zone to rule, with his brothers to the north and his kind of in-laws and the support of the English king to the south. He has a buffer zone between the Tweed and the Forth to rule. That's why he's called the Prince of Cumbria, which in this context means Strathclyde. Now, with the death of his 2 older brothers, first Edgar, then Alexander, David inherits both Alapa, Kingdom of Scotland, and his own personal territory. And overnight in 1124, the frontier shifts from the Forth to the Tweed. And this is what allows the expansion of Stirling in the 12th century. But we will come back to that, I promise. Now, I'm going to repeat this because I think this is both complicated and cutting edge. So, next slide, please. Now, just to the south of the Ford of Frew is something called Keir of Dasher, which is a fortification. Now, when we started digging at Keir of Dasher, I took at entirely face value that Ford of Frew was actually the Fords of Frew, that the Fords of Frew was the Fords of Forthrin, that we really could expect a fortification of the Fords of Frew to be a hill fort next to them. So we were expecting, or rather hoping for some kind of interesting date from the Keir of Dasher. And Keir of Dasher sits directly on the main route into Kippen. Now, looking at that map at the top, you can see the orange-brown road, which is the B822. That's the modern road and is predicated on a bridge over the burn. The original medieval and early medieval road actually runs to the north of Keir of Dasher, which you can see as the kind of the brown shape. So this is from past map, so it indicates the scheduled monument. So before the bridge, you actually gained access to Kippen from the north of Keir of Dasher, and Keir of Dasher controls that route. So next slide, please. Now, we've actually dug on Keir of Dasher twice, and we're about to dig on it a third time at the end of the month. And if anybody is interested in joining us on the dig, please email us. So a massive ditch, 6 meters wide, 2 meters deep, rock cut, 2 different sets of dates. The first in the first season, a date of 996 to 1153. So right in the middle of that Kenneth II reign. But the last season, we got a Roman Iron Age date, 1st, 2nd century AD, which is rather confusing. Now, what I think we have is a Roman Iron Age fort at a critical point, so probably echoing something like the Brochs north or south of the various fording points, and then this fortification gets reused during Kenneth II's reign. Right. So this is what I think is the lost Viking Age fort. But I'm going to go on and explain some of the wider context. So if we can get the next slide, please. Now, this is William the Conqueror. And obviously, this is the 1066 chap. And his invasion of Britain really conquers England south of Cumbria. And Cumbria at this point, Strathclyde, Kingdom of Strathclyde, is really a separate independent kingdom in 1072. Now, this is, 50 years before David I's coronation. So we've got a lot of change going on between 1072 and 1124. It's a dramatic period of change. So William the Conqueror is interested in Scotland, and he's interested in Scotland for a number of points, or Alapa at this point. Now, Malcolm III marries Margaret. Margaret is the granddaughter of the Anglo-Saxon king that Canute displaces. So Malcolm is married to a legitimate line of Anglo-Saxon royalty. His children will be heirs to both the Scottish and the English crowns. So William is very interested in Scotland at this point. He has an invasion, a whole series of invasions, but in 1072, he makes it to Abernethy and forces Malcolm to swear fealty to him. Now, the account of this invasion has William crossing the Forth. And the account does not mention a bridge, it mentions a ford. There is no bridge across the Forth in 1072, and that's because the Forth is the frontier, So from the Scottish point of view, you don't want a bridge because that makes invasion easier. So just as Wallace and Bruce in the Wars of Independence found the Forth to be their most reliable ally, so did Malcolm III. Next slide, please. Now, this is just this is what I did during lockdown. I actually wanted to check all these fording points, how the river looks, how wide it is. So we all decided to canoe, or rather, I decided to canoe the length of the Forth from Gartmore to Stirling, and I took my children along with me. And you can see Ailey and Kirsty here. Ailey to the front, and Ailey at this point says this was the worst day of her entire life, and stopped paddling. So that was all rather interesting. But we did explore the whole of the Forth. We explored all the fording points. We explored the tidal surges and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Now, when we combined the canoeing down the Forth with a look at Roy, the first edition, the second edition, we found multiple fording points, right? And here are the red circles superimposed on Roy to give you what is that 9 fording points between to the west of Fordoufru and Stirling itself. So lots of opportunities to cross the Forth, and of course re-emphasizing that point that this Fords of Frew is simply an invention of Scott. Next slide, please. Now, the most important of these fords actually has no reference to it ever having been used to ford. It's remarkable. This is the Abbey Ford. This is to the immediate east of Cambuskenneth Abbey. It's been subject to 4 metal detection surveys by friends in SARG, Scottish Artefact Recovery Group, and you may remember it featured on the River Hunters programme. We have an absolutely astonishing metal detection sequence from here. We got Middle Bronze Age axes all the way through to medieval coins, Roman coins, late Bronze Age weapons. The item here is a broken spear tip, horse bridle bits, all sorts of things. This ford is probably mentioned in the account of Stirling Bridge. This is where the renegade Scots suggested that the English cross in order to undertake a pincer movement on Wallace's troops. It probably also features in Bannockburn, the midnight raid by the Earl of Athol during Bannockburn that burnt all the Bruce's baggage trains. It is the only place on the Forth where you can cross the bulk of the river dry shod. It is absolutely remarkable, and no record of it exists in the history books until after the Reformation, when what we have is a series of events where that ford is being cleared, and it is systematically attacked by the people of Stirling for the best part of 300-400 years because it becomes an impediment to shipping. Now, I will come back to this, but it is an asset of the Abbey, and when the Abbey is dissolved in the Reformation, it ceases to be an asset and becomes an impediment to traffic, river traffic on the river. So next slide, please. Now, this is Drip Ford, which I mentioned earlier. Now, Drip Ford is actually the main fording point on the Forth after the bridge. It is consistently mentioned in travel westwards from the early 14th century all the way through to the 18th century. And also, just as an aside, it's actually always called the Fords of Forth. And there is a very good chance, I feel, that the Fords of Forthren from the 10th century actually means the Fords of Forth or Drip Ford. Now, this particular illustration shows the Roman remains. Are marching camps. Red circles are Roman coins. Yellows are fording points. The red line is the Roman road, and multiple sets of Roman roads. And of course, we've got Doon Fort, which should be in red, but is actually in black. And we've got Keir Hill of Gargunnock, Lecky Broch, Coldog Broch, and then the kind of turquoise blue circles, Moat Hill to the south of the fort at Stirling, and Gallow Hill to the north, lying between Dunblane and Bridge of Allen, the only native fort in Scotland to contain a Roman rotary quern. And I think what this does is this illustrates where the Romans are crossing. I think the Romans they build the road. I think they build a ford at Drip, and I think this fundamentally changes everything. The Romans are aware of the ford at Abbey, the Abbey Ford, because there's Roman coins over it. But I think this is their preferred route because the tidal surges at Drip are smaller than the tidal surges at Cambus Kenneth Abbey, at the Abbey Ford. And the Abbey Ford is the most easterly of the yellow arrows. Now, the reason that the tidal surges are smaller is, of course, that the Drip Ford sits to the south of the confluence of the Teith and the Forth. So it kind of crosses the old Forth, as they call it, rather than the new Forth. So I think we've got a sequence here. Prehistoric is Abbey Ford. Roman forward is Drip Ford is the most important, but the two still function as very, very important crossing points for Stirling and the source of Stirling's wealth. Now, significantly, with the presence of a ford at Drip, this becomes a permanent crossing point. The Abbey Ford relies on the tide being low. I don't think Drip does. Next slide, please. Now, if we return to that Chronicles of the Kings of Alapa, where Kenneth II orders the fortification of the fords of Forthrin, there's actually slightly more in that. There's a reference to a land battle at Moyn Uacora, which I can't pronounce, Uacora, and Alex Wolff has suggested that this is probably a two-pronged attack, a land attack and a sea attack. And just looking at the logic of fortification, now we've discussed Kippen, and we've discussed fortification, meaning perhaps the construction of a hill fort above the Ford of Fruit. Another option is actually a land barrier over the Roman road. Remember, the Roman road runs this way. And once you have the Roman road, that's the way invasions will go because it's the route that's guaranteed and it's marked out and it's laid. And indeed, we can look at Bonnie Prince Charlie using the Roman road in 45 and 46, 1314 with Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce using the Roman road to to know where the English are coming and then to line it with pits. So the red line on this maps a boundary between two boggy areas, but the blue line marks the neck of a meander between the Forth. And if you are going to fortify, block the road and thus block the ford, this is another option, which I think is worth considering. So next slide, please. Now, one of the things that happens is once you begin to think about logic and Roman roads and fords and crossing points, you begin to, other things begin to come to your attention. And this is very speculative, but the Battle of the Two Rivers in 671, which is the battle prior to the Battle of Duneccan. And this is where the Picts begin their resistance to Anglian rule. So the Kingdom of Northumbria has swallowed Edinburgh, has swallowed Stirling, has crossed the Forth, and is into Fife and Angus, probably, certainly controlling Stirling. An initial resistance to this, the Battle of the Two Rivers, 671, ends in defeat for the Picts, and the Northumbrian king Egthryth beats them. Now, the account is very vague. Hills, Picts, a concealed area, a ford, two rivers. And we've actually, some people have suggested it's the Erne and the Tay. Other people have suggested the Carron and the other big river in the Falkirk district. But it seems to me that the evidence fits this location as well as anywhere. Now, and that description is limited. Sweeping from the hills, an enemy host that was vast and moreover concealed, he slew an enormous number of people, filling the two rivers with corpses, so that, wondrous to relate, the slayers passing dry foot over the rivers, pursued and slew a crowd of fugitives. So Craigforth, where the insurance offices are, would fit the hills. If you kill people on a ford, say Drip, they wouldn't take too many people for you to be able to cross Dryshod, although, to be fair, crossing Dryshod over the corpses of your enemies is very much a poetical trope for medieval and early medieval battles. And we see the same thing with the Battle of Bannockburn. So just for your kind of, just offer that up. I think it's a credible alternative. But next slide, please. Now, another thought, and I am indebted to Neil McGuigan for this one. I've said that the Abbey Ford is the only place you can cross Dryshod, and traditionally the Cambus Kenneth. So Cambus is bend, so the bend of the Forth, and we often think that Kenneth is Kenneth MacAlpin, so Kenneth the First, and this is because there was apparently a battle with the Picts in the area. But generally people think that's a scribal error. They don't really believe there was a battle here. So we have another option. Perhaps the Kenneth of Cambus Kenneth is actually Kenneth II, and this actually relates to some kind of, limited memory of the fortification of the Abbey Fort, perhaps. Next slide, please. Of course, we cannot talk about the Abbey Ford without talking about the Abbey Fort, or the Abbey Craig. And this drawing here, many of you might recognise this. This is Christian McLagan's plan of the fort on Abbey Craig before the construction of the Wallace Monument, though anticipating it. Now, a controversial figure, perhaps, or subject to controversial interpretations. I firmly feel a case can be made that Christian McLagan is not just Scotland's first archaeologist, but perhaps the world's first archaeologist. And all of this hinges on what may be the world's first archaeological section. And it is much debated because there are people digging before her. But I feel she is the first person beginning to think about systematic excavation. Anyway, the Abbey Craig Fort is bivalate. It is vitrified, which means, of course, as you know, set fire to. The fire maintained for perhaps hours and days, the temperature reaching in excess of 1,000 degrees centigrade, such that the stone begins to melt and fuse with each other. So a simply awesome display of power. The smoke during the day, if you can imagine the whole of the Abbey Craig on fire, smoke during the day, and then that kind of burning fiery red eye of destruction visible at night. So here we have one of the outer ramparts, or a section through the outer rampart, and the dates here would coincide with the kind of 800-900 period. So we actually have it destroyed around that period, and we also have it refortified immediately afterwards, because there is a third rampart, and that third rampart contains reused vitrified material in its fill. So I think there's a possibility that fortifying the fords of the Forth might also relate to the Abbey Craig. So if we move on to our final slide, we have, and this is my third daughter, Heather, who did appear to enjoy her time on the canoe. So I think Kenneth, thinking about his frontier, Kenneth II, thinking about his frontier, does a number of things. I think potentially he is fortifying individual fords, perhaps Drip, perhaps Abbey Craig. I think he is also constructing or refortifying key locations, and this might be the Abbey Craig, and it might be Keir of Nashar. I think all of this is done to secure the fort against retaliation, a retaliation that ultimately we see the most ferocious example of with the invasion of William the Conqueror in 1072. So what happens? Now, as I said before, no one expected David to inherit. The death of his 4 older brothers is a surprise. And indeed, he has another couple of half-brothers who are even older. And one of those, Donald Ban, ends up being blinded on the orders of his nephews. But we won't talk about that. So I think Malcolm is conquering. Edgar or Alexander is building a castle. David inherits. Now that inheritance shifts the frontier, as I said, from the Forth to the Tweed. That means it is safe to invest. So Stirling gets to become a borough. It gets to become a borough as early as 1124, so possibly Stirling being 900 years old next year. Once you have the borough, you have the tax status. Of course, boroughs provide a legal monopoly for the king to secure taxes and therefore further investment. So you have a sequence of events. You have the borough, you have the Gildry, you have Cambus Kenneth Abbey, you have the high school, all of which are created within the 12th century. Stirling becoming the one of the fastest growing economies in Scotland at this point. The bridge, we don't know when the bridge is built. We know that it's there by 1180, and it seems to me that to secure Stirling's prosperity, that it's probably David that builds the bridge. This, of course, is the bridge that features on Stirling's Borough Seal. This is the bridge that William Wallace, was destroyed during the Battle of Stirling Bridge. It probably isn't William Wallace that destroys it. It's probably the English to secure their retreat. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. So we have a Viking fort. So what makes Kippen, Keir of Dasher, so important is that it's probably refortified in the 10th century, a very rapid strategic decision. But within 150 years, the strategic situations change. The Forth is no longer the frontier. The Forth is actually part of the kingdom and an artery for Stirling to develop its wealth. So Kippen is abandoned, Kippen is forgotten. So we actually have a perfectly well-preserved Viking Age fort. Now, to explain the two dates, again, I think we have a ditch that's probably Roman Iron Age, and then I think we have a quarrying event that is connected with Kenneth II, and I think the ramparts around Keir of Dasher are the Viking Age fort. So that's the story, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.